Hello everyone, this is Nitpicking Nerd, and I just watched the new miniseries Chernobyl, which I heard is one of the best shows ever. I saw it has the highest ever score on IMDb, and so I immediately became curious and started watching that, and watched it pretty quickly in a few days. I binge watched it. So, do I think it's the best show ever? No, but it's still pretty damn good. Has a lot of very good scenes, it has a lot of attention to detail, but it also has some flaws, and I don't think it's for everyone. I think some people might not like it, and I'll explain. For example, I don't think it's an all-family show. I don't think little kids should watch it. It has some scary scenes, some graphic scenes. They show some of the effects of radiation on some people in a very graphic way. Like, in terms of special effects, it was great, but psychologically, it's hard to see people suffering, especially when you know it's a real event, when you know those were real people, then it's psychologically difficult. And even parts in which they don't even show anything graphic, they only kind of leave it to the imagination, they imply certain things happening, like a baby dying and stuff like that. That's maybe even more difficult when we don't even see exactly what happened, and your imagination invents something even worse than the reality probably, and so some scenes in which they just imply what happened, those were even more kind of dramatic and difficult psychologically. So people who are too sensitive might not enjoy watching this. Also, some people might find parts of the show boring because it goes very technical in a lot of ways, like the whole thing about how the reactor works, all the technicians, what they're doing exactly. Some of those scenes were pretty long, and people who are not interested in the technical aspect of it might not enjoy those parts. Also, the show kind of goes political in some scenes, and so also people who don't like politics might find those scenes boring. I personally found both of those aspects interesting because I am interested in the technical aspect and also the political stuff, so I did enjoy those scenes. What I didn't enjoy, and that's the biggest flaw in the show for me, was that some scenes were just too long and too drawn out, especially scenes of just someone walking in a dark corridor and stuff like that. I never enjoyed those types of scenes, and I have to admit I even kind of increased the speed in some of those places because they just took their time a little bit too much in some parts. Sometimes they did it in order to build up suspense, to build up the atmosphere, and in those places it worked, like especially when they showed like the larger scale of things, like when they showed the city, when they showed some kind of landscape. All those parts I didn't skip because I did find them good scenes because you have something to look at. But whenever they show someone like just walking in a dark corridor for a few minutes, or someone diving under that building for 5 minutes straight and you barely see anything, those parts were kind of too boring, and so I kind of skipped some of those. But most of the show was good in that sense, even when it was kind of taking its time, because it was building up the atmosphere, and the music and everything was really well done, and it had that creepy factor to it, so it was like watching a horror movie, a horror show. It kind of reminded me in style to that movie Shutter Island, which was also a very creepy kind of movie, psychological horror kind of movie, and so it was very good in that same kind of style. So most of the show was good. I think the first episode was probably the most boring one because it was kind of too technical and a lot of scenes of just people walking around, and mostly taking place in those buildings, but only in the end of that first episode we actually see the city. And all those parts in which they saw the city, that was brilliantly done because they paid so good attention to the detail of how everything looked in that place and in that time period, like all the cars, all the clothing, all the props, everything was almost perfect. I can tell you, as someone who was born in the Soviet Union, and I still remember some of those things from my early childhood, like how the phones looked, how the inside of apartments looked, how all the devices looked like, and so it was really neat to see that attention to detail. They really did the research, they really did everything in almost perfect way, exactly a replica of that time period, and even the buildings looked like the Soviet buildings, because I think this show was actually filmed in Lita. So even the buildings and everything looked as it should, and they had a lot of scenes of showing the evacuation of the city, and so that was very impressive to see that. It was all with practical effects. You can see these are real cars. This is not some CGI painting of them. So, and by the way, my grandfather had a car like that also, I remember. So a lot of stuff made me really kind of nostalgic about my childhood. And in one scene I even recognized my own lamp, which I still have now, which was passed down to me, I guess. In one of the scenes in the hospital, I think, suddenly I kind of see my own lamp that I have on my desk, which is the exact same design, and that is a Soviet lamp. And I saw a lot of stuff like that all throughout the show, all kinds of props which I recognized, so a huge amount of attention to detail. So this was a very good show as a period piece, taking place in the 80s, very good recreation of that time period, of that place. And of course I enjoyed all the science elements of that, all the stuff about the reactor itself. There were a few changes they did for the show to make it, they kind of over-exaggerated a few things to simply make them more interesting for the show, which I don't mind. I don't mind changes for dramatic effect, as long as you don't confuse the people, you don't give misinformation. And in the very last episode, in the end of the episode, they did give you like a list of all the changes. They admitted the things they changed, some of them at least, and so that's why I kind of forgive those changes, because they did give the real facts in the end. And so I'm fine with a movie or a show kind of exaggerating stuff for a dramatic effect. Also, they kind of changed some of the characters. They invented a few characters, and so I don't mind that as long as they admit that in the end. And so they aware the audience of the real facts, and then maybe encourage even the audience to go and look up the real history, the real event. And so I'm mostly fine with those changes. The best scenes in this show, I think, that evacuation scene of the city, which I mentioned, it was just brilliantly done in the way how everything looked so real. Also, all the dramatic scenes about specific individuals, they kind of focused on a few characters which were real people, by the way, which made this all much more hard psychologically to watch people suffering and dying, and how it affects other people around them and all of that. So it was kind of depressing, but it was very well done just as a tragic, dramatic scene. And it had a few visually graphic scenes which were very well done in a practical sense. But a bit depressing, of course. And I actually read up on the real story, and maybe the real one is even worse than that. The real one might be even more graphic. So I wouldn't say that one was exaggerated, maybe even toned down actually. Anyway, that was probably the hardest stuff in this whole show, when they showed the effects of radiation poisoning on some of those people in the hospital. Especially hard was, this is spoilers by the way, there was the scene of that woman, that wife of that firefighter who was dying in the hospital. She didn't realize the effects it might have on her or her baby, I guess. And they constantly show us like clues of what will happen next. And then in the end of, I think the 4th episode, they showed her in the hospital after she went into labor. And the camera kind of goes between a few other women who gave birth, and they show each woman with her baby. And then it goes to that final bed. They show us an empty bed of a baby, and a woman sitting here alone with a depressed face. And that was probably emotionally the hardest scene, almost made me cry. I had a few tears, I think. And it was done without even showing us anything graphic or scary, and we can understand what happened, whose baby died, and she's sitting there with those other women who all have their baby, and she's sitting there all alone without the baby, and she also probably realizes it's her own fault because of what she did, being close to her husband. She probably feels guilty as well, thinking it's her own fault. And just imagining how she feels like really makes you depressed. So that was probably the most depressing scene. And also that funeral scene in which they didn't just bury those bodies, but they have to cover them with concrete. And how all of that was shot and shown, and with that music and all of that, that was kind of perfectly done as a scene. Really makes you feel like you're one of those people who are mourning. So really well done in a practical sense. So if you're a sensitive person, maybe you won't enjoy this series. It did have some comedic moments, by the way, as well. It did have some funny scenes, and so it did sometimes have some moments to kind of relax a little bit, and that's a good thing. Political in some places, which personally I enjoyed, but some people might not enjoy. And it had that whole subplot about the KGB spying on everyone, which was also kind of creepy. And it was a good kind of criticism of that whole thing. That was also part of the problem which caused that whole disaster. And the fact that scientists were afraid to tell the truth. They only cared about, not getting punished. The politicians and all of that. That whole thing was very well done, but sometimes it did feel a little bit kind of over-exaggerated to unrealistic level. Maybe it's simply because it was all kind of concentrated into just a few episodes, so they didn't really have time to develop it properly, and so sometimes it kind of felt a concentrated version of all those elements, and so it made it feel a little bit unrealistic. Maybe it's just because it was all kind of too fast, but that was a real thing. That was a real, it's not made up, so it's not, I wouldn't say it's a propaganda against the Russians or something, because those were real things, but it kind of felt like a little bit kind of in your face too much in some places. But if it wasn't done, then I would say it's boring. If it wasn't that way, I would say, what was the point of that whole thing if it wasn't like in the front of it? And so overall, I think they did manage to do the right balance between those, not making it too unrealistic, not turning it into a propaganda piece, but also having be parts of the story to make it interesting. And so overall, I was okay with that. Overall, I think it was done well. And the show had a very good kind of creepy factor to it all throughout, like a horror show. And the music and the sound effects also helped with that. and it had a lot of those atmospheric scenes, just building up the tension. And in some parts, they kind of exaggerated a few things to make it more dramatic or more interesting. For example, there was that helicopter crash, which they implied was a result of the helicopter flying too close to the reactor, over the reactor. But in reality, there was an accident with the helicopter, but it wasn't related to the radiation. It wasn't because it flew over there. It was because of something else. And so in the show, they made it look as if it's because it flew over the reactor. And so that's kind of distorting the truth, distorting the facts. But at the same time, it wasn't directly lying to your face. It didn't say it's because of that. They kind of just left it ambiguous. So I guess it's not too bad. There were a lot of other historical inaccuracies and exaggerations, such as that scene in which they said the reactor might explode even more and it might kill 50 million people and poison the whole continent and stuff like that. I don't think that was ever an option. I don't think that was realistic. That was an exaggeration by the show. I don't think what they described could have actually happened. I think that meltdown which happened, that was the worst thing that could have happened. It couldn't be even worse than that, as they tried to imply in the show. So that was kind of an exaggeration to make it more dramatic, to kind of add an wow factor to all of it. Also, that female scientist didn't really exist. They did admit in the end of the last episode that her character was supposed to represent dozens of different scientists who were all working on the problem, and so she was just put there to represent all of them in one character. I think that's fine to do that to simplify a TV show, because you can have like 100 different characters. So I think it's fine what they did, especially since they admitted that in the last episode. They showed the real facts in the end, but still I can't help but feeling that this is kind of similar to this recent wave of SJW Mary Sue characters to show a woman who is best at everything, better than every other man. This is something that is just being done in so many recent movies and TV shows, and so it felt a little bit like that because she was just such a perfect character in every way. She's a woman scientist who is the best at everything. She knows everything about everything. She solves most of the problems in the show. She's also the bravest and the most moral. She's just the bestest in every possible way. So that felt a little bit kind of unrealistic. It felt like a Mary Sue kind of character. And so she's not even a real character. So that's almost kind of poking fun at the whole Mary Sue thing. It kind of shows you something which did not exist. So that will only kind of make people think, okay, why did you do that? Why did you make her a woman? Did you try to push an agenda to show that women are better than men, or what? So it kind of felt a bit forced and artificial. Maybe if she wasn't that perfect at everything, like split her into two characters maybe. Don't put it all in one character, because she's just the bestest ever in everything. She knows the most from everyone. She's the smartest. She's also pushing for the morality, to uncover all the truth and to prevent future disasters. So she basically saved humanity, that woman, and so she didn't even exist. So that's probably a mistake by the show. I think they should have split her off, give the honor to the real people who are really there. I can understand you don't have the time and the room to have 100 different characters, but don't push 100 people into just one character. It just makes for an unrealistic Mary Sue type of character. So that's a minor flaw in the show. And by the way, I did feel that she's an unrealistic character even before I knew the facts, even before I looked it up, before I finished the show. As I was watching it, I felt it's unrealistic. And as for the whole KGB plot, as I said, it did feel a little bit exaggerated and maybe over the top a little bit. But overall, I forgive it, because if it wasn't that way, then it wouldn't be interesting. And so they had to do that. They had to exaggerate it a little bit to put the point across. And so overall, I'm fine with that, because the criticism of the show toward that whole thing is correct. And so overall, I like it, even if it's a little bit exaggerated. And there were other scenes, like that scene with the old lady milking the cow, who the soldiers had to evacuate. That was a very good scene, but I don't think that actually happened. From what I heard, very old people were actually not evacuated by force. They were allowed to stay there because it was presumed, because they're so old and they're going to die soon anyway, the radiation won't have time to do anything to them. So very old people were actually not forced to evacuate. So that whole scene with the old lady milking cow, which was a very good scene, but probably didn't happen, so it's not historically accurate. And I think when you do a movie or a show about a historic event, I do think it is important to kind of try to stick with the facts, at least about the important topics, or make it clear when you make things up. So I'm glad that in the last episode they did kind of show us some of the changes, some of the facts, but not all of them. So that's a small criticism of the show, that it's not entirely accurate, but you know, all the things they kind of exaggerated, they did that for a dramatic effect or to put some point across. And so overall, I don't hate any of these changes. But as I said, I appreciate most of all the attention to detail, and so in those places in which they did pay attention to detail, that's what I think it's best. And so all the things about how everything looked, how all the people looked, how the city looked, how all the props looked, that was all brilliantly done. So overall I would give this show not a 10, I would give it a 9, because it is a very good show. It has a lot of very well done scenes, all those dramatic scenes, all those tragedies, so all of that was very well done, near perfect show overall, but not perfect. So that's my opinion on it. Let me know what you think in the comments below, and I will see you all next time. Bye bye.